Okay, so morning to those live and online. Just thank you for reminding me. So the program is this Tuesday will be the last year, and then we break till after Pesach, till basically till Rosh Chodesh. Yeah. Okay. So I will try by the end of Tuesday year to still finish this little sub-sugya so that we can move on through no fault of anyone. It's taken us a long time. And obviously try and use the bin as one for Chazara. I can't emphasize enough actually how important Chazara is, because especially when you're learning Be'iyun, you can very easily lose sight of the wood from the trees, and the nature of a chaburah like this is it's fairly slow moving. It's chaval, you won't put so much work into it and then it will evaporate. So I would say Chazara really should be two things. One is going through the flow of the Gemara. So when we focus Be'iyun on this, so we spent quite a lot of time thinking about, in a sense, from the flow of the Gemara point of view, the less important half of the sentence. From the flow of the Gemara point of view, the significant part of the sentence is if it doesn't have Shum in it, you can't move it. And we will get back to that. But from a halachic point of view, the first half of the sentence, which is that if it does have Shum in it, you can move it, as a very important principle in Halacha. So one loses sight of the flow of the Gemara. So one part of Chazara is like a Bekias type Chazara, just a general flow. You're just asking yourself, okay, the basic questions are maths sugya. So how many pieces of information does the Mishnah give me? You know, if the Gemara discusses the source of where Halacha comes from, Minani Mini, what's that source? If the Gemara establishes a Mishnah is only talking about particular circumstances, which is indeed what the debate of this Gemara is about, what's that? What are the basic halachic principles the Gemara teaches me? That klishim melachot issa is or isn't allowed to be moved l'soch gufo l'soch makomo. That's like the bekias maths cheshbon of the sugya, which is Chazara. And the second half of Chazara is, okay, what are the main concepts or principles I've learnt? Unless you're gifted with a mind like Rav Yosef, you're unlikely in a year's time to remember who said what and all that. And it's not necessary. I mean, it's nice if you can remember it, but most of us aren't capable of doing that. But what we can do is come out with what are the main concepts. So as I go forward with Masechet Shabbat or whatever it is that we're learning, I'll always have familiar to me what are the main concepts. Okay, so there's different ways of understanding klishim melachot issa. The debate around Muktza is this. So just draw out like the main concepts that we've emerged with, and that then will be a useful chazara. Even if you don't come out remembering whether the Bal Hamor or the Rosh said this or whatever, at least the main talking points of the sugya are clear in your mind. So I know myself, in my own experience, unfortunately, the Masechtas that I learned, that I really put hard work into, and I didn't do proper chazara on. And years on, I can look at the Daf Gemara. Not only do I not remember the Gemara, I can't even remember ever having seen it in my life. I don't remember that I did it if I don't have notes inside of my Gemara. That's how bad it gets if you don't do chazara. So I would very strongly encourage everyone to do chazara if that's all possible, and maybe it'll even get you out of a bit of Pesach cleaning. So you may have some side benefits also. Yeah. Okay. If we revert back to our going back from the encouragement chazara back to the topic, so we were looking at Shum and why the Shum inside the garlic press helps stop it being Muktza. All I want to do today really is try and finish off this subsection of the Gemara, so that next year we can learn through Nehemiah and sort of finish off this sugya. So we saw so far really the Rashba, who thought that this was only a halacha in the garlic press because the garlic is pressed. The whole reason it's Muktza is because it's a press, and therefore the very thing which makes it Muktza, in this case I'm sort of subverting and I'm using it for something useful. The Rosh thought this was part of a pattern of halachas, like Kikah and Tinuk. He didn't think this was only an allowance with a dead body. He thought with any keli, if you put something non-Muktza on top of it, it somehow means that the action is relevant to the non-Muktza item rather than the Muktza item, and therefore you can move Muktza items. This is a general solution to the problem. Thus, this is what we saw thus far. There is a third view in the Rishonim, which actually has historical interest also to it, and I'm not sure if anyone has ever pointed this out, so I'll share that with you. In the source sheets, I printed I think I printed the Meiri. Yes, I printed the Meiri. The Meiri brings in the name of Gedolech Kadmonenu Shebenavona. The great ones who preceded us in Narvona gave an answer. So this is the third line of the Meiri in source 8. Lo omru l'taltal davar yodei kikah tinuk shemanichem bo b'Shabbos elen in meis bilvad. Ava kol kasha shika shehakikah l'shom mei erev Shabbos kol davar shemelachta me'issa nitzol b'shviloi. So the Meiri brings from the Gedolei Kadmonenu Shebenavona. Narbonne is in South France. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So he brings from these anonymous early great authorities in Narbonne, who, again, just to remind ourselves, basically, the reason our sugya is an interesting linchpin sugya is because it's a resolving clue in two other sugyas. Because on Daf Mem Gimel, we learned that you can put a tinnik and a kick on top of a dead body and it helps. In Daf Kuf Mem Beis, we learned that only works for a dead body because of the allowance of dead bodies, because of Kavod Abrius, because of the stress of Adam Bohul, because of the stress of bereavement, where people are confused. In our sugya, it seems to say that having something non-muktzah and something muktzah helps for anything. So how do we resolve it? So one answer was the Rashba's resolution, it's only with a garlic press. A second resolution was the Rosh, who says it's only with a keli. And a third resolution is the Kolbo, is the Chachmei Navona, the elders of Navon, the great people of Navon, who say that it is anything which is, the difference is whether it's on Shabbos or Erev Shabbos. The Gemara that says that you can't put a kicker or a tinuk on top of the mace is because we're trying to sort it out on Shabbos. The allowance to change functionality and effectively repurpose this as a means to hold a non-muktzah item is only only if you're doing it on Shabbos, is only with a mace. If you do it before Shabbos, why not? If before Shabbos you put something non-muktzah on top of it and you've determined its status before Shabbos as a means to carry something non-muktzah, there it would help, even not for a mace scenario. So basically we've had three distinctions. The Gemara says that kikkor tinuk only helps with a mace, with a dead body. One suggestion is the Rashba, that's generally, but where it's the very functionality of the object is different. The second suggestion is a Rosh, that a mace is just a lump of biomass. A keli, which has a functionality to it, you can resolve by putting something on top of it. And the third answer is the Chachmi Navon, the Gedolei Navon, who say that the answer is, if you do it before Shabbos, this rationale makes sense. Because before Shabbos, the whole point of a muktzah item is not to set aside for any use. When Shabbos came in, it wasn't set aside for a use, or it was set aside for a non-use, a klisha melachot l'isra, and therefore I can't move it on Shabbos. That's what muktzah means. But if before Shabbos came in, I'd already placed something on top of it, then that can make it non-muktzah, because before Shabbos I already indicated that I wanted to use it as a means to carry something that isn't muktzah. But if I do it on Shabbos, that allowance doesn't make sense, and that's where the Gemara says there was a rare exception made for mace, just because of the extreme circumstances of a dead body, but not in other scenarios.
Yeah. You've got pots containing food.
Yes.
Too much. On Shabbat, something too small. That would be held as muktzah.
So, right. So the truth is, we'll get to this halacha l'maisa. A pot should probably be considered a klisha melachot l'issa ulaheta. Because pots are used for cooking, but they also have a subsidiary use for non-muktzah meanings, which is they're used also to store food. So halacha, a pot can be repurposed on Shabbos because it's a klisha melachot l'issa ulaheta. And incidentally, we hold that that even we paskin not like Rav Yehuda. So we paskin even a hammer, which is a klisha melachot l'issa, you can move the tzorech gufa. You can move when you have a need, a non-muktzah need for it. So a pot certainly can be used to store food because you're using it so good for non-muktzah needs. And as it happens, even more than that, a pot is arguably, unlike a hammer, which is klisha melachot l'issa, I could just occasionally find how often to use hammers to crack coconuts with, as opposed to pots, which is it's quite normal to use a pot for both. It's true, its main purpose is cooking, and therefore it's a klisha melachot l'issa. It may be a klisha melachot l'issa laheta, in which case you would have even a greater allowance. Okay, so this is a third view on the sugya, which is that that on Erev Shabbos, always putting something non-muktzah inside a muktzah item would help resolve it and remove it from its muktzah status. I say this is of historical interest because who are these Gedolei Kadmonenu, our great predecessors from Navon? So any place I could find this view brought is a sefer called the Kolbo. So there's a halachic work from the era of the Rishonim called the Kolbo. Kolbo means everything in it. It was like an encyclopedic halachic work, and no one knows who wrote it. And there are two main theories as to who the author of the Kolbo was. Theory number one is that it was the Rivosh. The Rivosh is Rabbi Yitzchak ben Sheshes. He lived in the 14th century in Spain. And the second theory is that it was Reb Aaron HaKohen of Luniel, who was born in Narbonne, and who lived in the 13th century in Provence. Now, this view of the kolbo isn't just brought in the Meiri, but it's also brought by the Ran. The Rivosh was the student of the Ran, and therefore it is unlikely that the Rivosh Ran would be quoting a work from a student of his. Rabbi Aaron of Luniel preceded the Ran by almost 3/4 of a century, and he came from Navon, which fits the description that the Meiri gives him of Gedole Kadmonenu min Navon. He preceded the Meiri, and he came from Navon. And therefore, if the kolbo is the source that's being quoted here, and it's the earliest source I could find, and if these two candidates for authorship are the only two options, then we have evidence that the author is not the Rivosh. There seems a clear and conclusive evidence that the author is not the Rivosh. And if the only other, at least someone who fits the description of Aaron HaKohen of Luniel, in that he was preceded the Meiri by about 75 years. He preceded the Ran. He was not Talmud of the Ran, but a predecessor of the Ran, and he came from Navon. He was born in Navon. So that's just for those who are geeks around these matters. I find these things fascinating. And I'm sorry for boring everyone else, but I find this this very interesting. So anyway, this is a good piece of evidence. The Chidah, who had amongst other things, had a phenomenal historical sense and knew. I'm almost embarrassed talking about Chidah. The Chidah was from the Gedolei Olam, and he knew everything. He already was of the opinion that there's other pieces of evidence that the author of the kolbo was not the Rivosh. So, despite historically many ascribing it to the Rivosh, including a sefer called the Shalshalas, like Amon and others, I think it's clear from this and from other cases that the kolbo is not written by the Rivosh. Anyway, so that's just as an aside for those interested in these matters. Okay, so this is the we've reached a conclusion, as it were, in our sugya and the view of the different Rishonim as to how to learn the Shum that's inside it. I just want to use the remaining time to talk about just to sort of flesh out the distinctions between these different views and the nafkaminas halacha that emerge. The first and most basic nafkamina halacha is to what degree can you use a kikkar or a tinuk to detoxify a Muktza item. Now, how relevant is this shaila la halacha? Because of course we don't paskin like Rav Yehuda. We paskin halacha that any klishim melachot issa can be moved l'tzorech gufa l'tzorech makomeh. So if you're using it for something, you don't need to come onto the heter of kikkar and tinuk anyway. So really, the nafkamina as to whether we paskin like the Rosh or the Rashba. So let me just flesh this out. The Rashba says you can't use kikkar and tinuk to detoxify Muktza. The Rosh says you can. So is that relevant in halacha to do it? Now the nafkamina of this will be number one: can you use a kikkar and tinuk in a case which is a more severe type of Muktza than klisha melachot le'isa? For example, Muktza machmas chisar and kiss. Can you move it if you have something which is or Muktza machmas gufay? So the Rosh says you can't move it if it's Muktza machmas gufay. You can't move a stone on Shabbos by putting a kikkar and tinuk on top of it. Can you move something which is chisar and kiss by putting kikkar and tinuk on top of it? Second question is, maybe the heter of kikkar tinuk can help if you need, as Adam correctly said, if you need to move a klisha melachot issa, mechama l'tzel. Chama l'tzel is the way we phrase other needs to move klisha melachot issa when it's not l'tzorech gufay. So again, I have my hammer or my pot. My pot or my hammer is a klisha melachot issa. I can move it for a heter purpose on Shabbos if I want to use it for mutter purpose, like storing food in or breaking coconuts. What happens if I just want to move the Muktza item for another reason? So if I use it in a l'tzorech makomeh because I want to get it out of the way, again, that would be a l'tzorech makomeh. What happens if I want to use it for its own sake? Mechama l'tzel, that's referred to, moving it from the chama, the sun, to the shade. Why do I want to move it from the sun to the shade? Because I don't want it to get ruined. So I mean, pots and hammers don't get ruined, but something which will get ruined by being in the sun. I want to move from the sun to the shade. So that's where the Muktza of klisha melachot issa clicks in. I'm not using it for its non-Muktza use. I'm not using it for functionality. The whole lomtus of my klisha melachot issa is allowed to be used. Why I can use a hammer to crack a coconut is because it's a keli. But even though it's Muktza, it's still there. It's to serve me. And therefore, it's if I find a way of using it that happens to be mutter, like cracking coconuts, I can use it for that. But mechama l'tzel, I'm not using it for alternative use. I'm using it to preserve their own entity, and the entity is primarily a klisha melachot issa. At the end of the day, it's a klisha melachot issa. So could I use kikkar and tinuk as a solution for that? More than that, could I use kikkar and tinuk when there's no need to move the item at all? If I just want to move it around for no reason whatsoever, how broad is the heter of kikkar and tinuk? Is it only for a purpose, or is it even enough to allow me to move it for no purpose whatsoever? So just to summarize what we've said so far, the first and most basic nafkamina between these Rishonim is whether there's a het of kikar and tinuk. Can I put a non-muktzah item on top of a muktzah item? However, this machlokas is relatively limited in practical halacha because we paskin that you can move a kli shemalachto leisa. You can use a kli shemalachto leisa l'sorech gufay or l'sorech makomo. However, there still remains an nafkamina, which is does kikar and tinuk help for more serious forms of muktzah, like muktzah machmas, chesar kiss, a valuable item which I wouldn't repurpose for another use. So we discussed this, I think, last year. A valuable item. So I have a precious vase that I wouldn't use for anything else, or a delicate artifact, or a picture on the wall or the like, something which it wouldn't be the norm to move. Would kikar tinuk help for that? And was it helpful for Michamal itself if I want to move a muktzah item just in the shade, or I want to move it even for no purpose whatsoever? So just working through these points one by one, I left you with a riddle last week. I quoted Rabbi Kiva Eger in the last year, and Rabbi Kiva Eger, I should have actually said, sorry, I forgot, it's still in the Shabbat this week. So to turn up to learn in the Shabbat this week is a phenomenal achievement. Yeah. Okay, so no, we're really to come and learn Torah in Shabbat because I can cancel my share during the Shabbat this week, so I'm not up to your after Pesach. I will not be going share during Shabbat this week. So yeah, so Kolakot. Okay, so we saw Rabbi Kiva Eger. Rabbi Kiva Eger asked really this question: Does kikar or tinuk help with a muktzah machmas sarin kiss or not? And Rabbi Kiva Eger gave a genius proof from our sugya, and he said, look, our whole sugya is going in Rav Yehuda, who treats any kli shemalachta l'isa equivalent to what we would call chasaron kiss. He says a kli shemalachta l'isa isn't mutter l'sorech kufur l'sorech makomo, and yet he would say that it is mutter for kikar tinuk according to the Rosh's reading of the sugya. So therefore, by extension, Rabbi Kiva Eger thinks that you can kikar tinuk would also help for muktzah machmas sarin kiss. Let me just try and explain the shah a little bit more crisply, just to make this clear. La halacha kli shemalachta l'isa still is a kedi, and therefore can be used for sorech kufur sorech makomo. On that, the Rosh holds that you can do it, you can move it al yedei kikar or tinuk. Rabbi Kiva Eger, what happens if we have a kedi which can't be repurposed for another use, also known as muktzah machmas sarin kiss? The whole point of muktzah machmas sarin kiss is it's a delicate object or an immovable object which you wouldn't repurpose for another use. As a kedi, normally kedim are made for any use or could be used for anything else. You have in your back of your mind, I could use a kedi is there to serve me. But sarin kiss is a kedi which I wouldn't use for any use. Does kikar tinuk help with that? Says Rabbi Kiva Eger, I have a proof that yes, because even though our sugya is talking about kli shemalachta l'isa, it's talking about it in the view of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda holds you don't repurpose kedim. That's why Rabbi Yehuda says that even a kli shemalachta l'isa can't be used as sorech gufay, and nonetheless he holds kikar and tinuk helps. So you see that even a kedi that can't be repurposed can be helped by kikar tinuk. Thus, says Rabbi Kiva Eger as a proof for this halachic question. It's not for me to quibble on Rabbi Kiva Eger, other than to point out that Rabbi Kiva Eger evidently felt that there wasn't room to distinguish between the levels, but in principle, in theory, there is room to distinguish between the levels, the three levels. At the end of the day, we have muktzah machmas gufay, which is a stone or a dead body, something completely useless, where kikar and tinuk doesn't help. We have kli shemalachta l'isa, which is the opposite extreme. It's a kedi. It's useful for anything, but Rav Yehuda holds it's not made for use of any other use, and therefore you can't use this hammer to crack a coconut. But it's not removed from that use. It's not that there's anything in it that intrinsically contradicts that use. It's just not used for those things, and therefore it's not made for that use, and therefore he thinks it's muktzah. And in the middle we have chasaron kiss. Chasaron kiss is a kedi. It's not a useless lump of nothing like a stone or sadly a dead body. On the other hand, it is a kedi, but there's something within it that contradicts using it for anything else. Using it for anything else would contradict its primary purpose. There's nothing in using a hammer to crack a coconut that contradicts using it as a nail. It's just Rabbi Yehuda says it's not made enough for that. But the whole point of muktzah machmas sarin kiss is it's a delicate object. You wouldn't use it. It's a valuable object. You wouldn't use it for anything else. Its primary use contradicts, removes it from being made to be used for anything else. So maybe there kick and tinuk doesn't help because it's removed from being used for anything else. So Rabbi Kiveika's right doesn't seem a knockout blow. It doesn't seem absolutely conclusive. Rabbi Kiveika seems to be saying that Rabbi Yehuda's understanding of Kli Shemalachot and Issa is akin to our understanding of Muktza Machmas because not necessarily. There's layers of distinction over here. It may well be that Chesaron Kiss, in a sense, is closer to a stone than Kli Shemalachot and Issa. Kli Shemalachot and Issa, Rabbi Yehuda's of the opinion, there's nothing that stops it being used for anything else, but it's not set aside to be used for anything else. That's a far cry from Chesaron Kiss, which even though it's a keli, is with respect to all other uses removed from those other uses. It's contradicting its use. You wouldn't use it for anything else because it would damage it or risk damaging it to use it for something else. A Chesaron Kiss is an example of Chesaron Kiss is an Ismail Shalmina, a Moel's knife. Very delicate, it's very precise. And you wouldn't use it to cut your gefilte fish log with because it would get damaged. It's a piece of high-tech, precise instrumentation. And it gets a little nick in it and it becomes useless for purpose. So you wouldn't use it for anything else. So its main use contradicts the use of anything else. Such a thing would be, it's difficult to understand, mathematically speaking, how the raya of Rabbi Kiveika works and whether you can conclusively prove the point from our Gemara to Chesaron Kiss. Rabbi Kiveika obviously held that the father he was making over here, they didn't think the distinction was enough. And he thought this was a reasonable comparison. I'm certainly pointing out that mathematically there is you could draw a fine line between the two levels. What about using the heter of kicker and tinuk for no purpose whatsoever? Could you use it just because I want to move around for no reason whatsoever, Muktza item, or only if there's a burning need like chamalotzel or the like? So you could argue that that since the allowance to move a kicker and tinuk is for any use whatsoever, there's no limitation on moving a kicker and tinuk. The whole lomdus of making the kli subservient to the kicker and tinuk should be even in the case of no need whatsoever. So again, let's just think this through. Is kicker and tinuk a knockout blow? Does it help completely to allow you to move the Muktza item, but willy-nilly for no purpose whatsoever? So the cleanest logic on the sugya would suggest that yes, it does. Why? Because kicker and tinuk can be moved to anything. There's no limitations on moving a loaf of bread. There's no limitations on moving a child. You can move them for no reason whatsoever. So if the whole logic of the keli, which is holding them, is that it becomes subservient to the needs of the non-Muktza item on top of it, the logic would seem to suggest that you can move it whatsoever. And this remains, in a sense, the cleanest logic of the situation. There isn't a logical point to say that you can only move it for a purpose and not for no purpose whatsoever. However, the Prima Godim, who is a very, very senior posek, isn't convinced of this. And he says, even though the logic would suggest this, nonetheless, maybe at the end of the day, the allowance of kicker and tinuk is an allowance. It was a heter made as a way of resolving need. And therefore, in a situation of zero need, you shouldn't rely on this heter. In other words, he's saying that the logic of kicker and tinuk isn't as clean as we would like it to be. It's not that in and of in itself, there's an absolute rationale that if I put a kicker and tinuk on top of an object, I'm treating it as a tray and my action only relates to the kicker and tinuk, and this is simply the means of moving the kicker and tinuk. At the end of the day, it's an object with its own intrinsic chashivas, its own intrinsic value. So who's to argue which one is the determining feature of my desire to move it? And then he says at the end of the day, there's a bit of a kvetch, a bit of an allowance in allowing me to move the Muktza item because of the kicker and tinuk. And then he says maybe Chazal created this allowance in case of necessity, but not just as a clean slate to allow me to move it for no reason whatsoever. So what we have here is by the way, when you translate Lomdus into Halacha, one often sees this at work. In principle, the cleanest svara seems to be that it should be a complete allowance because that's the whole way kicker and tinuk works. But the job of a posek isn't to say it's the cleanest svara, it's to say, is this absolutely convincing? Or do we know that it's not an allowance? Where they pushed a halacha in order to allow you something because of needs, but it's not a complete get out of jail free card. And the Prima Godim therefore urges caution in this respect. Yes.
With the corpse.
Yes.
In that case, you didn't want to move. It's really the corpse you wanted to move. You didn't want to move.
Yes.
Now we're talking. I know we're sort of moving that now into a different case.
Yes.
But now you're talking about whether you really want to move the at all, whereas originally that theory was not.
You're correct. And even here in this case, what happens if I'm just using it as a solution to move the object underneath? And you're right, in the case of mace, the Gemara really in Kufman base said it was an allowance for mace because a person is overwhelmed with a mace or covered mace, covered abrius. So you do see that the Gemara is willing to extend it in a kvetch case just as an allowance out of necessity. And indeed, the heter is in a case where I'm using the kik and tinnik as a solution to a means to moving a Muktza item. So yes, you could argue like the Prima Godim that this is a sort of necessity heter rather than a clean blanket heter, and no place, and therefore I wouldn't call it b'diavad. B'diavad is after the event or something like that. The literal meaning of the word b'diavad is b'diavad once it's done. Here you can do it lechatchila in the first instance, but only when there's a necessity, when there's a reason for doing it. That's the point of the Prima Godim. And the Prima Godim's weight as a posik is that's, I mean, unless we find one of the Gedolei posik argue on him, that's the knockout blow. So the halacha, even as I said, in a sense you could argue that the clean svara is not like that, but the Prima Godim says at the end of the day we find that this is an allowance of sorts, and therefore he doesn't think this should be extended beyond necessity, and therefore the halacha we paskin only in a case of necessity. And believe me, again, I will give out halachic sources just for everyone to have a look at this inside. Yeah.
I saw the issue before that, isn't it? My understanding was it could be dependent. It could be dependent on whether if you're turning the kli into disham after laheta, you couldn't move it whatsoever. Even if the kick on top of it. If you're turning the kli, if you're subjugating the kli and it's becoming toppled to the loaf, and essentially you're just moving the loaf, then you can move it for no purpose whatsoever.
Yeah, I've seen similar arguments. Who did the dish you quote this from? Do you remember?
Well, Cardiff against
Right, yeah, okay. So I saw similar arguments. That, firstly, these far as at the end of the day are a bit speculative. They're not convincing. Secondly, at the end of the day, the Prima Godim, who's the most senior host to address this issue, says all said and done, these are all nice speculatives as far as, but we don't have evidence that Chazal allows it in a case of non-needs. And in a sense, from my mind, that closes the sugya. So what you're saying is right. It's a nice piece of reasoning. But it's a nice piece of reasoning, but it's not definitive. So it would be definitely something worthy of mention in an Eon share, which this is meant to be. So it's a fair point. But once we come to the realm of halacha, of nafkamin l'maisa, at the end of the day, these forwards are not knockout blows. And the Prima Godim says, I have no evidence that this is anything beyond an allowance, and therefore the heter of kicker or tinnik should only be used in a case of needs, but not as a winning in the heter. That's the view of the Prima Godim. So, but I will have a look. I didn't see the dishes. I will have a look at it later. And maybe I'll revisit this next. I'd like to see what Rav Osno or Rav Karet says. Whether they address this Prima Godim, maybe they address the Prima Godim and so on. The final enough minutes I'll just mention, because we've only got technically 5 seconds left, is I mentioned this nafka min actually previously, so I'll just remind you of it, which is the heter only for the pot or even for the lid of the pot? So if the basis of the heter is one of functionality, then the lid of the pot is a shared functionality of the pot, and the heter would help. That would work, for example, in the view of the Rashba, that you've repurposed the functionality. But if it's just that it's like a bosses type of thing, or it's toffel to or something like that, it's a means of moving it. The pot is a means of moving the thing inside it. The lid has nothing to do with that, and therefore you wouldn't be allowed to move the lid. And again, that would be another nafkamina between the reasons of the Rishonim. We'll stop here. And next year, Mi'at Hashem, either I'll send it as the sources, or we'll go through it very briefly, just a few lines of Mishnah Berurah, just so that we all come out clear, halacha and ma'aseh and all of this. And also, I'll try and address Rav Nechemiah. So on Tuesday, please focus your learning on Rav Nechemiah, because that's where we will learn on Tuesday, Mi'at Hashem. Yeah. Thank you very much.